Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we are here to have the official conversation and run through of the H 484, the Education Transformation Bill.
450.
454, whatever the number is, that's it. It's on our agenda. It's been a day. Thank you to all of you scattered around the room who were able to get here today. I know it's been really a challenge to get everybody here in one place, so we really appreciate it. And at some point, I think we'll have either the chair or the ranking member down from Ways and Means also. I may send a text or just remind them that we're starting. But in the meantime, we are starting with the fiscal note. And Julia Richter, who did the education funding, you'll recall that yesterday when we talked about it, she didn't have a final one because they were going to be finishing up and voting on it this morning. So this is pretty hot off the press. And so that's, Julie has to be at another committee on around 1:45. So I've asked her to start by going through this. And she is our expert. You've been working on this for months, Julia. So welcome.
Thank you.
Take us away.
Great, thank you. I'm Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. There is a fiscal note on the committee page under my name. There's also a link to the JFO website where we have worked to compile the relevant slide decks that are reflective of the bill. So it shows some of the modeling and data that we presented in House Ways and Means. I also want to note that the fiscal note was not just worked on by me. I'm also joined by Chris Roop and Ezra Holben, who have worked on sections of the bill as well. So it really is a team effort. But getting into the swing of things, Madam Chair, would you like me to go ahead and share my screen with the fiscal note?
Why don't you? Because I think there'll be people watching.
Okay.
So we have on our desks the 14-page fiscal note and a draft timeline. Okay.
Great. Yes. So the fiscal note is 14 pages, but the bill itself is 155 pages. So I guess it's still kind of
the longest fiscal note you've ever written.
It is the longest fiscal note I've ever written. As a team, I will say.
Yes.
So would you like me to just go ahead and start walking through the fiscal note?
Yeah, and we've been through a bunch of this, so generally high level. This is not our go into the weeds time so much.
Okay. Sounds great. So I'm just going to start ahead. So starting out, this bill would make numerous changes to Vermont's education system, as well as its education finance system and funding. And we've talked about all of this in different pieces throughout the past week or two, but now it's all wrapped up into one bill. So this fiscal note is reflective of what was voted out of House Ways and Means this morning. So a number of changes. We'll walk through what each of those changes are in high level. But starting out in terms of the fiscal impact, I want to note that since much of this bill is due to take place in future years, a lot of this is the funding changes specifically are contingent on the operation of new school districts, July 1st, 2029 at the earliest. So a number of those fiscal impacts, while we estimate there will be fiscal impacts, the impacts themselves we cannot estimate because they are dependent on a number of outstanding policy decisions. There are some fiscal impacts of the bill in fiscal year 2026. We've outlined those in this table here on page 2. So you can see that there are a few costs to the AOE without associated appropriations. There's also a couple of one-time appropriations, as well as a couple of increases in based costs.
So since this will be Rep. Mariki's committee report on the floor, since you have education, it's all here. It is. It's all for you. But it looks like there's some costs, but the only appropriations are the State Board of Ed and the special ed staff person. Would that be correct? The actual appropriations, 350?
That is my understanding.
Okay.
Ezra, is that accurate? Yeah.
Okay. Huh?
And this does not include the $4 million that we already appropriated from general fund money for reasons beyond our knowledge at this point in time. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did we appropriate or we just set it aside?
We fenced it off for the agency of education and said that we have to have detailed plans before we'll actually approve the appropriation.
Okay.
So the money is there for them.
Yeah, I know we didn't spend it. I just
That's
didn't know
right.
if we actually.
It's there and the money is fenced off and there for the agency of education.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Would you like me to go section by section or stay high level?
Do you want to just talk about those fiscal impacts in your chart?
Sure. So section 2, this is, there's 5 additional non-voting members that are added to the Commission on the Future of Public Education. This is specific to that school district boundary working group. So there would be an associated cost of per diems. There's no appropriation made in that bill associated with those per diem costs.
So AOE can pick it up.
That would be a question for the AOE. They did have the $200 million appropriation to AOE in FY24. And then that was carried forward into FY25. You'll recall originally that was for the school construction task force and then rolled forward to also allow for uses of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. We reached out to the AOE about a week ago and our understanding is there is about 53,000 of unobligated funds remaining in that appropriation.
All right, so they don't need any money then. Okay, thank you.
There's a one-time section 6 and 26. So section 6 is the policy piece. Section 26 is the appropriation language of a one-time general fund appropriation of 200,000 to the AOE.
Just to back stuff for a second, you mentioned the FY was $2 million. And so 54, only 54 was unobligated. So
Remaining, yeah, and that's I'm referencing this final, these final 2 sentences here in the second paragraph of section 2.
So of the information of the money obligated, is it applied to any of these things? Or?
No. Um, 6 and 26, those are, we'll talk about that in more detail later in the fiscal note. It's there, but it's an expansion of the State Board Education Rules Review. And so this is a one-time appropriation for contracted resources.
The 200,000.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
The bill also establishes the state aid school construction program. There's an estimated cost for 3 AOE positions to staff the program, which would need to be hired prior to the program start. Those costs would require an ongoing appropriation because it would be new staff, but neither positions nor appropriations have been included in the bill.
And would those be FY26 or FY27?
I'm gonna phone my school construction friend. Yeah,
First, joint fiscal, I think that depends on the timing and pacing of the program rolling. You know, I don't believe the bill actually creates those positions. It's just a need that had been expressed in order to run the program and see something running. And there is a report that is required of the agency to be submitted to detail a lot of their resource needs. And I believe that report is due at the end of, in December of this year.
December 1, 2025.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit more of a.
Okay. Okay, so. Fine, thank you. We aren't gonna worry about that one.
There's also, with the School Construction Advisory Board, the 3,000 estimated cost of per diems, no appropriation made in the bill for that. Sections 32 and 33, there's a reference, a special education strategic plan. There is an appropriation made in the bill, a base general fund appropriation to AOE for a new position to support the development of this work.
So when we had the education piece last week with Beth, I remember the $200,000. So is this part of the Ways and Means Amendment? 150, I don't remember that in the Education Committee
I'm gonna phone my friend Beth. Jeannie's office in the legislative council that was part of the education.
It was, okay. Went over my head,
I don't
sorry.
remember seeing it either, actually,
I
so.
just
it's-
remember the 200.
Peter.
Position?
Special education.
Introduce
Oh,
yourself.
sorry, yes.
It was added by Ways and Means.
Yes,
Okay,
sorry.
we didn't miss it.
Okay.
We're okay now, so far.
Feeling better now. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And we'll hear more about what that means later on, I think. So go ahead.
And then there's also a base cost to the Department of Taxes, which is factored into the department budget of 20.
Into their budget, okay. All right,
So that's the high level overview of the FY 26 costs.
So where you got total costs, that's total needs, would that be a better term for this? Because it's not, you got what's going to be appropriated, but then you got, the other things are going to be needed.
Yeah, so the total cost is reflective of the sum of each of these line items that we've spelled out here. As we noted, some of them, there are appropriations, others there are not. So the cost is reflecting all of the costs outlined here, and the appropriations are outlining the appropriations made in the bill.
So when is it anticipated we would need to appropriate money for the remainder of needs, if you call them.
I think that's a question as to the details of some of these outstanding policy. For instance, the cost of the positions from the Agency of Education. They're going to report back with a description of those positions, as well as a question to the AOE, right? For instance, we spoke about the Commission on the Future of Public Education, an estimated increase of 9,000 for the per diems. They do have that 53,000 approximately remaining in unobligated. It's a question for the AOE, I think, as to if there are additional needs there.
and that, we should be able to see that in a carry forward report too, which we have. So let's go through, again, sort of high level, the rest of the sections for background and details. And I know that we've sort of been talking about this section 2 a little bit.
Yep, so the section 2, this is what we've been speaking about with respect to the expansion of those non-voting members to the commission for the district boundary work. Section 4, this is a class establishing class size minimums for grades K through 12 in Vermont public schools. We can't estimate the cost of this section because while this may reduce the number of teachers, the extent is unclear because we're not talking about a staffed student ratio, but a class size minimum. Section 6 we've included in here because it's associated with the appropriation that's included in section 26 of the bill. And I am going fast, but if you'd like me to slow down, let me know.
If there's questions, but we
Okay.
the whole idea was that we were going to hear a lot of this right before
Right.
today, so that today can be a little bit more quick.
Okay, sounds great.
You're great so far, Julie.
Okay, section 7, this is intent language about school size. Again, the way that this plays out in policy decisions will influence the estimated impact. Sections 10 through 14 establish would establish the state aid for school construction program. And Chris has outlined, some of those high level pieces included in the state aid for school construction.
Shannon?
It talks about, state payments there, right?
Mhm.
50%, to 20 to 40%. Where's that money coming from?
So that money would come from the school construction special fund, which does not have a funding stream by and large. There is later in the bill a waterfall contemplated from the supplemental district spending reserve that we spoke about yesterday. But the funding stream beyond that,
What happens if there's not money in that fund to pay the 30% or whatever the number is?
I see Chris ready to talk.
Yeah, so Chris from Joint Fiscal, if you recall during the bill walkthrough yesterday, was it yesterday, a couple days
It
ago?
was yesterday.
The language stipulates that AOE would have to submit a request for funding through the budget process every year. So there would be, the language contemplates that AOB would have a prioritization process to evaluate what the needs are and what, you know, rises to the top priority lines. That would then be submitted by AOB to the fifth floor whenever they do the governor's recommend budget development process. That way, that annual funding request comes through the typical appropriations process and is evaluated by people when we do the big bill. There is no dedicated revenue source contemplated.
But what happens if there's no money in that fund?
There's no money in that fund, you can't obligate additional work, so I think that's something you need to think about whenever you're figuring out what you're going to fund in terms of construction is what is your fiscal resources.
Maybe to follow up on that, I'm not sure if it's you, Chris, or somebody else, but if there's a need for a school construction project and there's no money in the fund, then I would think that school district would have to do the bonding and voting and pay for 100% of it itself. Is that what would happen? I'm getting nods over here. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about this?
Hi, I'm Lynn Farnheiser, Chair of the Means from Bellborough. I think a lot of what is contemplated in this bill is that this is maybe half of the work and there are still significant outstanding work we need to do next year. Some of that is, final decisions on how school construction will work in partnership with the Treasurer's Office. Some of that is what to do with outstanding debt that's currently sitting in districts, outstanding reserves still sitting in districts. There's a fairly significant list and we've managed to find that. I don't think anyone's promising that this bill does absolutely everything. But it begins the process of figuring all of that out. So we would need to find out what the districts are and what the school construction essentially sort of rules and guidelines would look like before we can make those decisions.
John had a question and then Tom.
So thanks for being here. Sorry, of course this morning. So currently there really is no special fund yet. This is what would be part of the overall scheme of which you're looking at here in the plan. So nothing would really be in there for some time. I think I kind of asked that question yesterday. With this particular piece right here, there'd be a time at which there might be enough in there to perhaps fund in part or in whole small things, but not large things.
I think everyone's.
And I think that's what I understood from what we talked about yesterday.
I think what we've been saying in sort of our two committees since the beginning of the session is that we know that this significant reform work can't happen without putting money towards school construction. And no one's been able to get their heads around how we would fund that this session.
There really is nothing out there currently. Is that correct? Unless there's some reserve in various districts, is that correct?
And we put in place some policy changes last year, the year before, to try to add some caution tape on districts spending significantly on school construction right now, given that we might have significant changes that might
Require
that in the future.
Is there, and this is probably too far in the future to even know here, but is there a goal in terms of how much we ought to have in when we start moving that out perhaps? That's going to take time.
There are two really fantastic reports about that.
Peter Coleman, House Education. The answer to that is, it could be $25 million a year, it could be more. And that's why the future decisions about how that funding takes place are really so crucial. But to be able to at least see the program would be a start. It's a point.
Okay. It's a thorny issue and continues to be. All right, let's continue, Julia.
Okay. So moving on past the school construction pieces of the bill, to sections 18 and 19, this would add qualifiers for permitted payments of tuition. So it adjusts which entities a school district may pay tuition to. Again, this fiscal impact would depend on future policy decisions and behavior, so we can't estimate cost or savings of these sections at this time. Section 26, this is that 200,000 appropriation that we already spoke about. That's tied to section 6 related to the state board rules, and AOE resources.
Let me go back to that last one. Do we have a list of schools that currently receive, because of school choice, that will no longer be allocated because of the 51%?
I do not have that. I do not know if that was information provided by the AOE to House Education. If there was a list of schools of which independent schools would no longer be eligible.
This was a proposal in the governor's plan, and AOE for that prepared a list of approved independent schools for public tuition and gave the breakdown of their
Percentages.
ratio between publicly funded and privately funded. So you could derive from that what it is. So that exists someplace.
Is it on your website, your committee page?
I'm not sure if it exists there or not. I can try to get a little bit for you.
Okay.
I'm thinking out loud. I know in our district we have, and it's a policy choice that we'll be making, but Long Trail, for example, some students go to Long Trail, including one of my neighbors. Or Killington Mountain School, will they no longer qualify? I just need to know that, that's all.
I think you'll see language that says that if you're already there, you don't get kicked out.
Oh, you don't? So what's the 51% for?
Future?
Future.
Future.
So,
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Go ahead.
if I may, section 18 sort of adds those qualifiers, and then section 19 essentially permits the payment of tuition for students currently enrolled through graduation.
Until they graduate, that's right. That's
So it's
what I
that.
remember. So it's
Phase
not
out.
necessarily forever, but if they're enrolled at XYZ school where there's only 40% tuition and they just started as a freshman and they've just enrolled, they'll get the tuition for 4 years. None of the kids will get hurt. They'll get to stay where they
Yeah,
are.
this doesn't take effect for a few years anyhow.
The tuition part?
This,
No, I think it's during the 24-25 school year.
so this is effective July 1, 2025. I'm just gonna say the back of the fiscal note has a table with all of the effective dates. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Wayne?
So maybe it's, what's the rationale? What's the thinking behind the 51% number? What's the rationale for limiting private schools?
Yeah, so the, well, the 51% was really originated in the governor's proposal. He had to do his as well. And so us it is sort of to recognize that we know that some independent schools approved to take public tuition have necessarily served in place of an existing public school. We can take the 4 historic academies as a perfect example. They have served the role of high schools in those communities for 200 years plus. And it is to sort of recognize that there are schools that have served that role and will probably be needed to continue to serve that role in the future.
And going forward, what's the flip side? Why would it? What is anticipated to be dealt with the 51% going forward?
Well, so moving forward, well, what the future state of school districts look like depends on how they are sort of individually chartered. So if we have 10, 12 districts, each one's going to require a charter, and what will be what will need to be figured out is in the sort of assignment of students to schools. How do you recognize the individuality of each district? Because there'll be some districts that have no independent schools that have historically served all school students, some will. And so that'll really come down to how we individually charter each district.
But you're in the long run, you're going to discourage any creation, any new independent schools.
We have a moratorium on new independent schools that's been in place for a couple of years already.
So I'm going to keep us focused on some of the money piece with Julia, because she's going to have to leave and we will still have other people here who can talk about some of these other sort of non-money things. So I'm going to steer us back. Thanks.
Sure. So that's sections 18 and 19. We spoke about section 26. Section 27, this is amending the determination of the amount that a district would be paying in tuition to a receiving school. So in this foundation formula state, the tuition would equal the base amount that we spoke about yesterday, and we haven't gotten to yet, that 15,033 multiplied by the weighted pupil count of the students attending the school. So this is changing the way that tuition payments are calculated. Sections 31 through 33 require AOE to develop a special education strategic plan. So they have to come back to committees by September 1, 2025 on the factors contributing to the growth in extraordinary special education costs. And then requiring the agency to develop a 3-year strategic plan on special education.
Will be to reduce, or I guess understand it, but then ultimately maybe reduce special education costs. I don't know whether that's.
I'm not sure if there's intent language or Chair Kornheiser would be best speak to that, either Beth or Chair Kornheiser.
Well, wondering what the goal is of having this strategic plan, because I hear about the factors contributing to growth. Is that we're trying to bend the cost curve, or what's the deal there?
It's two pieces. There's the cost curve of extraordinary special education, which has gotten wild, and we don't actually understand quite why. So we can't hard to do something about something we don't understand why it's happening.
Yeah. And
then we know the implementation of Act 173 has not gone to plan, and also want to get to the bottom of that. In sort of all conversations we've had over the last maybe 6 years, there was always an assumption that a foundation formula should include a weight for special education rather than a block grant for special education if we had one. And so before we do that, we want to make sure that we really have our hands around special education the way we don't right now. So yes, the goal is bending the cost curve, but also meeting kids' needs.
Right.
Better.
Okay, thanks.
And experts agree that both of those things should be possible simultaneously.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Julie.
And this is where we saw that establishment of the permanent classified position in AOE to support the development and implementation of the strategic plan.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm not going to read ahead yet because I'm more interested in listening as we're going along, but does this address the notion that we talked about, we not here, but just in general, of shifting services away from the property tax that perhaps belong in the general fund?
I would say that from my perspective, the bill does not contemplate that. If that's underlying intent, I would defer to your colleagues in one of the committees.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to speak to underlying intent to ask for all of your partnership for next year on that actually. There are a number of sort of studies or tasks for next year that do involve some of the costs that might make some sense between the general fund and education fund. Adult education is in there, there's a few others like that. And so
We just don't actually talk where we, and so that idea of shifting things to the general fund is clearly a little painful, but in this case, well, in most cases is really necessary.
Okay, let's go to the new finance formula and restructure of the property tax, which I bet you spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, so this is where I have spent the bulk of my time is on these next sections of the bill. So our way of structuring this is sort of putting a fiscal note within a fiscal note. So sections 34 through 56, this is that establishment of the new education finance formula and restructuring of the statewide property tax. So these first few paragraphs are really just trying to provide a high level overview of what we spoke through yesterday, some of the intuition. So this should all look very similar to what we spoke through yesterday, because nothing substantive has really changed since our conversation yesterday afternoon. So repealing the statewide ed finance formula and establishing a new funding formula, foundation formula, and instead adjusting the statewide property tax structure, doing away with the current income sensitivity and replacing it with the homestead exemption. So I'll just keep going unless I'm asked to pause. I do want to note that the bulk, unless otherwise noted, the bulk of these sections, as we spoke about, are effective July 1, 2029, contingent on the operation of the new districts that are contemplated in the bill but have not yet been established. So because of that, the full impact of the changes is unclear because we don't know, for one thing, we don't know what the school district boundaries are going to be.
Or how many school districts there are going to be.
And we're talking about multiple years out. So we don't know, for instance, the demographics of the state, nor how grand list values will develop over the coming years. So I will, before going into the sections, I will note, I think I led with this, but on the committee page, there is a link under my name to the resources to some slide decks of preliminary modeling that we have done for the House Ways and Means Committee. You'll see that all of that modeling was done using fiscal year 2025 data. So saying, and a lot of assumptions, but essentially if this were to have happened in fiscal year 2025, what are the changes that we would observe, all else held equal? And those slide decks have been included rather than on the website, rather than included in the fiscal note, because there are a number of caveats that are important to keep in mind when interpreting the analysis.
I just had Wayne and then Tom.
So the questions I've been asking about, you know, how the 15,033 was derived, formulas, the statistics, that sort of thing is on your JFO site.
So I actually did send you an email over the lunch hour with a link to the report itself. The report itself is not posted on the JFO website. It was originally a 2019 study with the Agency of Education where Dr. Colby and Dr. Baker established the original pupil weighting study. And in that 2019 report, which I would be happy to forward to the entire committee, outlines their methodology and the statistical analyses used in that work.
I'm interested in what data did they use? You know, what was the scope of the data? And, you know, what massages did they do to the data? What statistics did they run on the data? That stuff should be in there.
Yeah, so the 2019 report outlines it. I'm not going to testify to how many pages because I don't know, but it's a lot of pages. Spelling out the methodology. That was done in 2019 for the AOE. JFO contracted with Dr. Colby this winter and provided Agency of Education provided data for the last, 4 fiscal years, which included pupil counts, outcomes, education spending, budget data, students in different characteristics. And all of that data that was provided was consistent with the data that was used originally to run their model. So they took the modeling that they had done for the 2019 report, took the code, it was done in Stata, took that code and applied the updated data to reflect the updates to their model, and also presented in the memo, which is on JFO's website, calculated the amounts if they were to be put in a foundation formula. So it's important to keep in mind that the current numbers that we have under current law are reflective of our current financing formula. Dr. Colby did her work and Dr. Baker did their work as though these numbers were to be applied to a foundation formula. So very different ways of calculating weights.
So I don't want to get into, we're getting a little too far along. You go read the stuff and then you can ask questions. Okay, let's keep going, please.
Okay, sure.
Tom, sorry.
Is this $15,033, $2025?
Yes.
So in 2029, it will be the equivalent of that, but it'll be a different number.
Yep. So almost all of the numbers, unless otherwise, the weights, for instance, are not inflation adjusted, but all of these dollar amounts that we were seeing are inflation adjusted in the language. Currently, the inflation index is NIPA, which is consistent of the inflation index used throughout Title 16 in education finance. The bill does require JFO, I think that Chair Kornheiser mentioned this in the caucus of the whole, does require JFO to come back with a report about inflation indices that could be used in a foundation formula. And one of the considerations that House Ways and Means spoke about a lot was the inclusion of healthcare costs in inflation indices.
In this particular case, I just want to be clear that if this were in place today, it would, the foundation formula base would be 15,000
Correct.
and then adjusted as we move along.
Correct.
Thank you.
And then in 2029, it would be 15,033 adjusted for inflation up to whatever year.
Just like we do the minimum wage.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's, I know your time is limited, and so let's talk about the pieces in here that are, and we'll have other people talk about some of the other pieces, the
Okay,
pieces, or what did,
I'm happy to continue. I don't know if, I know that Erin is coordinating with Senate Education. I'm not sure.
if we can get, we're good? Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, so sections 34 and 35, this is that calculation of the weighted long-term membership and education opportunity payment that we spoke about yesterday. Repealing the definitions of education spending and per pupil spending. So this is where we see that 15,033, which will be adjusted forward for inflation. The education opportunity payment would be calculated by multiplying that base amount by the weighted long-term membership. The corresponding weighting categories that are included in H454 are listed here. We see that there would be tiered English learner weights, meaning that the weight would differ dependent on the level of language proficiency of the English learner, as well as tiered special education weights. It'd also be a weight for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The weights for grade levels would be repealed in the latest Professor Colby memo. They found that those were no longer significant cost adjustments to be included in the foundation formula.
So Julia, is this K to 12, K to 12, 1 to 12? What are the, if we got rid of the grade level, is it assuming what age?
So all public school students.
Even if they're pre-K?
That's my understanding. I'm right. Yeah.
Somebody's computer, Emily.
Yes, and pre-K is one of the categories that we are doing in the program.
Looking at, okay.
Because some hygiene feels like an understatement.
Yes. Yeah, okay,
And there's a study that they have.
great, thank you.
So essentially, in this instance, if you're an English learner level 1 proficiency in first grade or in 9th grade, you're going to have the same adjustment.
Okay, thanks.
These weights are additive, like weights are additive in current law, meaning that if a student were to be an English learner and from an economically disadvantaged background, those two weights would be added together and applied to the base amount.
Times the 15.
Correct. Mhm. So they're not mutually exclusive nor multiplicative. Requires consensus recalculation of the base amount, including any inflationary measures every 5 years by AOE and JFO. So that's the determination of the education opportunity payment and weighted long-term membership sections. These sections are technical amendments. Section 37, this is establishment of grants for necessary small schools and sparse school districts. For small schools, the State Board of Education is required for creating standards for the for schools that are small by necessity. So for the depending on what those rules are, the enrollment of those schools determined small by necessity will be multiplied by this amount in here, 3,157 adjusted for inflation. And then that will be a grant provided to the school district.
So this could be, for example, I'm just sort of throwing this at it. If you have a 2-hour bus ride, if they were to close your schools, they would not, that would be sort of a small school by necessity. Perhaps.
If that fits.
That's how they defined it.
The board's ruling. Mhm. There's also another grant, which is not mutually exclusive to the small schools. The other grant is the sparsity grant. And this is if a district has a population less than 55 people per square land mile, it would receive a sparsity grant for the enrollment of all of the students in a public school in that district. And that would be calculated by multiplying the public school enrollment by 1,954 adjusted for inflation.
Is that an attempt to recognize increased transportation costs? Because of the distribution of the households over a large area?
That's a reflection of Professor Colby's work. So two things. One, there is another report about transportation reimbursement from the Agency of Education. The memo and the work outlined population density of fewer than 55 people per square mile as being a cost adjustment necessary in the foundation formula. Section 38, this is technical. This is just amending the statute to reflect the changes to the funding formula. Section 41, this is the ballot language for the supplemental district spending. So you'll recall from our conversation yesterday in the caucus of the whole this morning that school districts may decide to put out to voters up to 10% above their education opportunity payment for a local vote. So this is including the ballot language of that supplemental district spending. Section 42, this repeals the special education census block grant. It's important to note that in the earlier sections, 34 and 35, the special education weights are being included. So we really need to think about the repeal of this special ed census block grant in coordination with the inclusion of the special education weights. So it's the changing the funding structure for special education.
And that's not till 2029 also, because you have to have all the other stuff in place before.
Exactly. Section 43, this establishes the supplemental district spending reserve. So this is what we spoke about yesterday, right? So if school districts decide to spend above their education opportunity payment and grants, and that if that's approved by local voters, then the school districts that do not have the lowest taxing capacity, that have larger grand list values, part of those revenues raised on those grand lists are going to be recaptured by the state. That's the equalization mechanism. And so those recaptured revenues then would flow into the supplemental district spending reserve. This is the supplemental district spending reserve is the reserve that has the waterfall to the school construction special fund.
I just want to, if I may, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So if a school spent more, they're in a sense penalized and the dollars go into the reserve? Would you not look at it that way?
I'm not going to use the word penalized
Yeah.
one way or another because I want to maintain my nonpartisan lane and not comment on the
I
policy.
apologize. Sure.
I will say that essentially the way that this works is if you have two school districts with different grand list values, the school district with more grand list value is going to be able to raise more at the same tax rate than the school district with the lower grand list value, right? You have a bigger
Sure.
base that a tax rate is going to be applied against.
Mhm.
The equalization contemplated in the bill says for the same tax rate, school districts should be able to raise the same amount of funds. But we know mathematically that if you have different grand list values, one district is going to be raising more funds for the same tax rate as the other. And so the equalization mechanism says every school district can raise this much money for the same tax rate. But we know they're going to be raising more, so that more that they're raising is recaptured by the state and put into the reserve. Does that make sense?
Helps. I'm wrapping my head around it.
I will say, my mind works better with numbers, as perhaps some of your minds work better with numbers too. On the JFO page, there is a slide deck that has 3 example completely made up, but example districts and the actual mechanism of how it would work. And I would recommend reviewing those slides if it would be helpful to see an example. And I would be happy to walk through with anyone those slides.
Speaking in Stowe tomorrow night, so I want to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
John, you had a question?
So Representative Yakavoni's question, that's related to that 10% max, correct?
Correct.
So if one school district's up here, one's right here, and this is the group here that, you know, goes to 10%, right? This one here can't go above that actual dollar amount. Is that correct? Did I understand that?
So essentially,
It was the end of
what-
the day yesterday, so.
yeah, so we have some number of school districts in this future state, right? And all of those school districts are going to have different education opportunity payments dependent on their long-term weighted
Yep.
average daily membership.
Got that.
Every school district can decide to spend up to 10% more of their own education opportunity payment. When we get into the supplemental district spending reserve, let's say that, you know, two districts both decided to spend an additional $1 million, right? This says, we're gonna totally make up a tax rate for 10 cents, you get $1 million, right? Regardless of your grand list value. You put 10 cents, a 10-cent tax rate on your grand list, then you get to keep 10 million. In one district, it's gonna raise that money. In the other district, it's going to raise more. In the district that it raises more, that more that's raised is what's going into the reserve.
So if they can raise 12 million on that 10 cents, they get 2 million goes into that special construction. Why don't they just say they're gonna raise less
Right.
and accomplish what they need without?
Would you like me to bring up the slides? Would that be helpful?
It might, I don't know how much more we have to talk about. And I also know that Rep. Dickinson who's on Zoom, has a question, so I want to get her in before we do that. Lynn?
Yeah,
You-
thank you, Julia. I'm just curious. I know this is supposed to be pegged to the lowest wealth property of the town with the lowest property wealth, the 10%.
Mhm.
Has any modeling been done? Is there any numbers from PVR that says what that number is at present right now? Or is it not something you can project based on the fact that we're not sure what is this going to be district-wide or by a town?
Yeah, so this is going to be district-wide, so that gets into the question of, we don't know what the districts are going to be, right? So if every district had exactly the same grand list per pupil, there would not need to be any equalization mechanism because every district could raise the exact same amount on the same tax rate. Depending on those districts, once we had the district's boundaries, we could determine the grand list value within the district and then do the calculation you're referencing, Rep. Dickinson.
So if you were in the, let's say in the kingdom, up in the northern part of the kingdom, and they had their own combined district of a bunch of places that are now SUs, that could theoretically be the lowest property wealth that everybody else will have to live with. And then it might change to someplace else in the future.
Yeah, that's correct. I will also note that the determination of property wealth is property wealth, grand list value per pupil count
Per
in the
pupil.
district.
So it's
And Rep. Kornheiser had a comment on this too.
I just wanna offer that when we asked Julia to do some modeling on this, so we could all have the exact visualizations that you all desperately need. We asked her to use essentially imaginary future districts, since this only applies to the future construct.
Right.
And that was 12 districts that are around a per county basis. For anyone who's creating a map in their head right now, I would caution you, the grand list value per district was significantly different than I imagined it would be. It's quite counterintuitive to some of your assumptions about
What's property rich and what isn't?
Yes, it was actually very surprising how everyone Kennedy. We spent a lot of time on property values for things.
Okay, so we can go take a look at that.
And again, there are imaginary districts, there's no policy teeth to those districts, or it's just public.
For example, so people can see it's something that's potentially concrete. Okay.
Would you like me to walk through the brief example slides or not? I want
Would
to,
that be helpful or not?
I think it would.
I think it would.
Okay, I guess we have enough people that say yes. to
Okay.
that.
I'll try to go through this very quickly. So, so this is not looking at modeling, this is an example. So, you know, we're nonpartisan, talking about the structure. So how would it work? Well, essentially, first we would calculate a supplemental district spending yield. This would be different than the yield in current law. And it would be done by the Department of Taxes. So this is not something school districts would need to do themselves, but I've included it here so you can understand the math behind it. So essentially, this is what we were talking about. First, we'd calculate each district's grand list per pupil, which we would do by taking its equalized grand list, so 100% fair market value, dividing it by the number of pupils in the district. So in this example, totally made up, I pretended there were 3 districts. Would it be helpful for me to make it a tad bigger?
Thank you. And I forget there's behind us too.
Seems making it bigger. Oh, there we go. But now it's small again.
Get to that page and, yeah.
I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. I'm gonna try this again.
I'm guessing this is on Ways and Means webpage somewhere too.
And it's also posted on your committee page.
Oh, it is.
Yep, it's a link to, under my name, there's all of the resources available. So if you click on one of those links, you'll see it. It's labeled Review of Supplemental District Spending in draft 4.1. So first, we would calculate the grand list value per pupil in these made up districts. Then we would say which school district has the lowest taxing capacity, right? The lowest grand list value per pupil. In this example, it would be District A. District A would have $1 million per pupil, while the other 2 districts, totally made up, would have $2 million. So then to calculate this yield that would be used is we would say how much could be raised in the district with the lowest taxing capacity, school district A, at a dollar rate per $100 of property value. So we would take the total grand list value, apply the tax rate, which would result in $1 million raised. We need to say, okay, how much property tax revenue would be raised per student in this? There's 100 students, so 10,000. So that would be the yield that every school district would get in December for calculating their tax rate. So then how does it work? We've calculated this yield of 10,000. Well, it would depend on how much a school district decided to spend in supplemental district spending. So if it's spent above the foundation amount, their supplemental district spending tax rate would be calculated on how much they spent per pupil above the foundation amount and what the district spending yield, what the yield would be, which we just calculated. So these are those parameters from the earlier slides, right? The grand list value, the pupil count, grand list per pupil, and the district spending yield. So let's say each district decided to spend an additional 2,000 per pupil, right? District C has fewer pupils, so their supplemental district spending is lower, but they all have $2,000 in extra supplemental district spending per pupil. To calculate the supplemental district spending tax rate, we would say, okay, how much are they, what is their supplemental district spending per pupil divided by the supplemental district spending yield that we already calculated. So we've got that supplemental district spending, their pupil count, all 3 districts we just walked through would have that spending per pupil of 2,000. We calculated the 10,000 yield. So the supplemental district spending rate would be 20 cents for each of these districts because they all are spending the same amount per pupil extra. This is that equalization that we're talking about. So they all have the same tax rate, 20 cents, because they're spending 2,000 per pupil extra. But now we need to apply that 20-cent tax rate to each of their equalized grand list. So by applying their tax rate, we see from the supplemental district spending tax rate that District A is going to raise 200,000, District B is going to raise 400,000, District C is going to raise 200,000. So then what happens? Right? We know that each district decided to spend an additional 2,000 per pupil. We know this meant that each district had the same tax rate. But because of the equalization, sorry, this penalty is a holdover from a previous iteration that Ways and Means was, and I was doing this late at night, so I missed that update, but ignore that and the penalty.
Yeah, okay.
So because of the equalization, districts that raised more than their total supplemental district spending, some of that would flow into the reserve. So what we're seeing here is District A, they wanted to spend 200,000 over, they spent it, and that's exactly what was raised on their grand list. So that's how much is going back to the district for their supplemental district spending. None is staying in the reserve because there's no recapture in this instance. This is the district with the lowest grand list value per pupil. District B raised more than their supplemental district spending on that same tax rate. They raised 400,000, but approved 200,000, which means that 200,000 they had approved goes to the district because that's what they approved and that's what their 20-cent tax rate corresponded with. But they raised an additional 200,000 because they had more grant list value. So in this instance, that 200,000 would stay in the reserve. Same goes for District C. District C raised more on that 20-cent tax rate than was approved. So they get what they approved, and the additional that was raised because they have a larger grand list value would stay in the supplemental district spending reserve.
Julia, is there ever a situation where the District B could figure out what it really needs without having to raise any extra to go into the supplemental reserve fund?
So the way that the math works here is I chose this where they're all spending the same amount per pupil because it made it really clean and nice
Right.
round numbers. But the equalization mechanism exists regardless of how much additional the district is spending, right? Because that equalization goes all the way back to when we were calculating that supplemental district spending yield. It's how much could be raised on a certain rate at the lowest district.
Okay. So you can't cut back and say, well, now we don't need to give any to the construction fund.
Right.
You just
So
would would get less supplemental district spending.
Right.
And you would raise a little bit less extra on your grand list, but the same proportion would hold
So
true.
it's been designed so that people can't really game the system. That's kind of where I'm going with it. Can't figure out a
They
way.
only need, if they need a lesser amount, this accounts for them doing that. They'll spend that lesser amount, but the extra would then go into the supplemental.
Exactly. So let's just say, for instance, District B decided to wanted 100,000 instead of 200,000 of supplemental district spending. Their tax rate would have been 10 cents rather than 20 cents. They would have raised 200,000 rather than 400,000. So they would get the 100,000 and then there would be 100,000 left in the reserve.
Wayne and Jim.
But, so it depends on how the supplemental fund will be spent. Is that money going to be, who gets to spend that money? Does it get spent on the district that saves that money? Or does it go into a pool and be spent wherever? And if it does that way, then you can kind of game the system. Just make sure your number's zero and everybody else spends more.
The supplemental district spending,
Yeah.
this is specific to the district.
So it stays in the district.
So it stays in the district. So the district votes it. If approved, the property taxpayers within the district see that tax rate, the supplemental district spending tax rate on top of their statewide education property tax rate. And that district gets the supplemental district spending that was approved. And the recapture, that's the term used in other states as well, the recapture is what would stay in the reserve.
So the 200,000 doesn't, the second 200,000 on District B, that goes into a pool for the due statewide. That isn't just for the town, is it?
The 200,000, yes, that goes into a statewide reserve in the statewide education fund. As the language currently as the language currently has it, that reserve is used for, if there were some miscalculations or underlying data that wasn't fully up to date when the yield was calculated, that's what that reserve would first be used for. Any additional funds left in the reserve are then what would waterfall into the school construction fund.
Right. So you don't actually, you're not keeping it in your own private district savings bank.
But you might be able to recapture it from that fund in some way eventually. So you know what I mean? So-
If you're doing construction.
Yeah.
Okay. Jim, did you have another question?
Yeah, just quickly, the additional amounts raised locally up to this 10%. Is that only on the homestead or is that on all property classifications?
All.
All. So that's different than what we do today.
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the things that is perhaps challenging is comparing this system to the current law system, because a lot of the words are the same, right? We've got a yield in current law, we have a yield here, we've got equalization in the current law, we've got equalization here. But the actual equalization mechanism is very different. You are correct that under current law, the homestead rate is reflective of the district's spending decisions, whereas the non-homestead rate is not directly.
Right.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's
Okay,
continue.
Do you have-
related to that.
Okay.
This allows for 10%,
Up to 10%.
up to 10%. Any idea what that variation is today between the average and the higher spending?
I found that,
Oh, okay.
I found something.
What is it?
So Central Vermont had the highest, using the current, what is it, the current?
No, so I believe the modeling that you're looking at is the,
SBA regions.
yes, the
Board
Board
Association
of
regions.
School Districts that they were having me model with.
So, yeah, so Central Vermont had the highest equalized grand list value. And Kingdom North had the lowest, and Franklin Grand Isle had the median.
I think, and I think that one piece that's also really important to note is this gets back to the district boundaries.
Right.
And the districts that are determined will have significant implications to the district with the lowest taxing capacity, to your point.
So however we put that together, and then they have other ones. This is actually pretty interesting, because it also has it by homestead and other things, the whole thing, so.
We did all sorts of,
I know, and then Rutland
Modeling.
was median and the homestead one. Okay,
and that was something also that House Ways and Means was looking at a lot, is depending on if you were looking at the aggregate grand list, homestead and non-homestead, or if you were looking at solely the homestead grand list or the non-homestead grand list, you would see the highest grand list value and lowest grand list value and median shift.
they do, I'm seeing where my county was nothing in any of them, and suddenly became the lowest in non-homestead.
That is here.
I can send you a link to that.
And I also want to clarify that the 10% that you are referencing is not 10% of the grand list value. The 10% is 10% of the education opportunity payment, which is that base amount multiplied by long-term weighted membership.
Okay, let's continue.
Okay. So, oh, there is a hand raised.
Oh,
Chair.
Lynn,
Yes, hi. My understanding is that this would be a way to stop the situation we have now, where if a town like Burlington raises their budget by 12%, and everybody else has to help pick up that cost. And someplace like Fairfield, for instance, had a 26% increase in their taxes because even though they were very frugal some years ago, they still had to help pay for that Burlington increase. Is that what this is supposed to be doing, or am I getting this wrong?
I won't speak to intent. I will say that school district spending decisions above the base amount no longer will impact other school districts' tax rates, which is different than current law.
Okay, thank you.
Charlie, did you want to say anything?
Yeah.
Introduce yourself and then come on over.
Hope you don't mind. Nice to see you again. Charlie Kimball, representative from Woodstock, representing Windsor 5. Just a couple things. Julia often reminds us that it's a policy question and doesn't always speak to intent. So we really appreciate her unbiased opinion on the numbers. So what we look at is a couple things. One, we really consider whether or not the base is sufficient, and we really want the base to be sufficient in calculating what a student district needs. We had a lot of discussions about whether or not to even allow spending over the base amount or what the education opportunity payment was. And in the end, we felt like there are a couple things. One is that it is just within the district. The second thing is to consider that district could be much larger than the current district. So the education, the grand list per pupil could be substantially different from what you experience now in your community or in your school district because it's shared over a larger base. So I talked to one representative who was really nervous because her community had a high grand list per pupil. But when considering that she might be paired with, her district might be paired with other communities with a lower grand list per pupil, then that fear went away a little bit. The third piece is I hope you like the title too, because supplemental district spending was a long, drawn out process to determine what that was. But the intent is to give those school districts a measure of local control beyond what just the base formula comes up with. Because in the past, the state has not always kept up its side of the bargain with the foundation amounts in the 70s and 80s. So this is kind of a check, if you will, that school districts have over whether or not the state is keeping up its side of the bargain. But we did want it, we had discussions over the limit of the 10% is what we ended up on. Some states that we've talked to or talked to the consultants about have already had their over base spending go up to 25% in the case of Colorado, which creates some real inequities and some real Brigham kind of concerns. So we really wanted to ratchet that down, but not to the point where it was not meaningful. The last thing I wanted to say is that in calculating to Representative Dickinson's question, is how much would this be? Do we have an idea? Maybe it was Representative Harrison. We don't know how much it will be because we're not sure first what the districts look like and what they may want to spend more than that.
Comes down to districts. Okay, Wayne, and then we'll move on.
See, that's why I was been asking these statistical questions, because I can foresee using GIS and essentially modeling. Now, taking all the different towns, different school districts now and just iteratively building different ones and seeing how the numbers play out. Then you'd be able to see what the range of variance would be, what the midpoint would be, and you'd be able to then derive something that was pretty much in the middle for your base, and then you'd know what else you might need to supplement. But until I see those numbers, I'm like, it's a black box.
Yes, and the other part of that is we've asked the committee that we're charging with coming up with district boundaries to consider what the grand list per pupil is, the tax capacity of those school districts, among other things, geographic patterns, and whether or not there's a career and technical center in that district, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot for them to consider. They will have access to the VCGI tools and other tools to really look at what does that district look like. Facilities index of all the facilities in the district as well, of all the schools. So they're going to have access to all that information and trying to draw the new districts.
All right, let's continue.
Sure.
Too far.
You can
Stay, but I'll be the part of
Getting near the end of this fiscal note.
We are. So that's the supplemental district spending reserve. Sections 44 and 45, I think we've spoken about already. These are the transportation reimbursement grant report due back from the AOE. And then the reports mentioned for JFO to look at one, pre-K and CCFAP and other early care and learning systems. And then a second report to look into inflation indices to be used in the funding formula. Sections 46 and 47. This is the establishment of the statewide education property tax and the supplemental district spending tax rate. So there, you'll recall that there's the single statewide education property tax rate that will be set annually by the legislature at a level sufficient to ensure the ed fund is fully funded. And then there's those 4 property classifications that are broken out, that would be broken out, homestead, and then the 3 non-homestead categories. Currently in the bill, the factors associated with each of those 4 classifications are 1. So it would be a uniform statewide property tax rate across all classes. If those factors were to change, then there would be different tax rates corresponding with the changes that were made to those factors. This is also, we've spoken about the supplemental district spending, and that this is talking to the supplemental district spending tax rate that we just walked through, how that would be calculated, right? By taking the supplemental district spending per pupil and dividing it by the yield. The new yield, not the current law yield. Next, section 48. These are amendments to the contents of the December 1 letter to reflect the new education funding formula. So including in the December 1 letter, the pieces of data that would be required in order for school districts to be able to calculate what their supplemental district spending tax rate would be. Also including things like grand list value and school district specific data. Sections 51 and 52, this is the repeal of the statewide property tax credit, the current income sensitivity in our property tax system, and implementation of the homestead property tax exemption that would be based on household income. The municipal property tax credit that is paid out of the general fund remains unchanged in the bill. The homestead exemption can be seen here in a table. This is reflecting the words in the bill. And so you can see that as household income increases, the exemption on the claimant's house site value decreases, phasing out at $115,000.
The 115 maximum, is that in statute with this bill? So it doesn't change, or is there an inflationary adjustment?
It is adjusted by inflation.
It is.
So the 115 would live in statute, but it would be adjusted by inflation to the year.
And so this is the exempt. So if somebody was living in a $100,000 home and they made under $25,000, they would only be taxed on $5,000 of the home.
If someone was living in a $100,000 home, and what was their household income?
Somewhere between 0 and 25,000.
Oh, yes,
So they'd only be taxed on the $5,000 value of the home.
correct.
So do all these numbers get adjusted by inflation?
All of the household incomes do, yes. The percentages do not.
Calculating household income similar to what we do now, whatever that form is.
My understanding is that the definition of household income hasn't changed. John?
Yeah, that's correct. John Randolph, that's correct. That's right.
Julia didn't mention, but this really smooths out the cliffs that we've got right now at $47,000 and $90,000, the existing property tax credit. So the 47,000 circuit breaker right now. And so you'll see a little funny anomaly. The income bracket is 25 to 47 and 47 to 50, because that reflects kind of the existing situation. So it's trying to take what we have now and move people along to even out the curve. So that is what it does. It's a weird kind of thing in there, but we talked in the committee about adjusting that, and we decided, you know what, just leave it there for now. Yeah.
What makes $47,000 the magic number again for this? It's always been there, it's been a different level, but I mean, does inflation, $47,000 now is the same as 47,000 20 years ago? Why retain that number?
It's in statute now and a lot of folks have managed to that number from a different perspectives. Julie may have a different idea on this. Yep.
From from something that the modeling shows and that the committee grappled with is when thinking about the property tax credit or income sensitivity in general, we're talking about foregone revenues to the education fund, right? So the expansion of the homestead exemption or property tax credit, the image is often pushing on the balloon. So if you reduce the liability over here, it needs to be made up elsewhere. So something that the committee was directed me to work on in the numbers is trying to maximize the number of households that would not see an increase in their liability. And one of the ways to do that is to tie out the 47,000 in here with the 47,000 in current law.
And that represents varying levels of percentages of area median income. So in Burlington, that's going to be closer to 50%-ish of area median income, whereas in St. Johnsbury, that could be closer to 75% of area median income. Is that right? I mean, we're just using the flat number, not the area median income or the times of poverty level or anything like that for this.
This is uniform across the state. That would be a policy decision.
Sure. No, just, it's 47,000's been around since the beginning of Act 68, basically. And so
That's why we're putting it on inflator in, so we don't have to revisit this.
just want to be clear, again, it's not my father's 47,000.
This would go into effect, this section about the homestead exemption, is that again, once you have all the districts figured out and
Yeah.
everything's dependent on the districts getting figured out. Also there. Okay.
So it's the idea, and the intuition of this sort of is all of the property tax pieces and funding pieces all kick in at the same time. So the foundation formula, the household exemption, the classifications.
That's July 20.
Correct, contingent on
Contingent on
the school
what
districts.
things actually look like.
Mhm.
Yeah. By then.
Section 53 is before that contingent effective date, essentially requiring the Department of Taxes to make sure that the forms align with the homestead exemption implementation. Sections 58 and 59, we're now moving away from the July 2029 contingent effective date. This is moving to the evidence-based foundation formula. So the numbers that are included here are reflective of the cost factor way of calculating numbers to be included in the foundation formula. This is contingent on other policy changes happening, changing the numbers that are included in the bill. Madam Chair, there is a hand raised. I don't know if it's helpful for me to share that with you.
Is that an old hand or a new hand?
It's a new hand.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I read this earlier and I'm just curious. Oh, crumb. What is evidence-based as opposed to what we're doing now?
It's two different methodologies of calculating foundation formula amounts. So a helpful way to think about it is the cost factor calculation is sort of thinking about a top-down. It's examining the current state and the dollars in the current state and the efficient way of allocating those resources. Whereas what the administration's proposal included was based off of the PICUS model, the evidence-based amount, which is a sort of what are all of the building blocks and how much do they cost? And that's how the foundation formula amount is calculated.
Okay, so we do not have evidence-based now based on the PICUS report. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the PICUS report is an evidence-based approach. What we have in current law is cost factors, and this bill currently has the numbers reflected in this bill are reflective of cost factors.
Okay, so I'm trying to read this. It would so contingent on the number of aspects outlined in the bill, sections 58 and 59 would adjust the foundation formula amounts from the cost factor to the evidence-based. So what evidence are we looking at? I mean, how does that different, so all the stuff we're talking about now is all cost-based. This is what you vote on, this is what it costs, this is what your income is, this is what your percentage is. What would how would that change for evidence-based? Would we have to rewrite this, or where does that show up in this bill? I'm confused, Julia.
May I ask John
Yes,
to help me answer that question?
John Gray, the instances where this would show up start in sections 57 through 59. This is under the reader assistance heading. I think it's granting into future foundation formula or something to that effect. But basically, the two pieces that you need to tweak when you move from a cost factor foundation formula to an evidence-based foundation formula would be your base amount, because what we currently have at the current cost, right? You have a new base amount that is evidence-based based on particular practices, and then you would need to tweak the weights as well. So what you'll see in sections 58 and 59 are placeholder language that changes the base to $10,000. And it changes the weights to all be 1.0. And what the point of these sections is to force the legislature to revisit the numbers on meeting the contingency that triggers transition to the evidence-based foundation formula. Does that make sense? Okay.
Lynn, does that make sense to you?
Well, I don't have the actual bill. I'm just reading the fiscal note.
Yeah, it starts on page 125 of the bill that got voted out of Ways and Means.
I guess so that means we're gonna do this, and then at some point in the future, based on the 1.0 tax rate, I'm not sure what the 1.0 stands for. There's a bunch of things that are 1.0. Then we're gonna have to revisit this and go back to an evidence-based formula. I mean, this is based on what, on our testing and scores, or on the number of students, or what is the evidence that we're looking at? I'm sorry, I'm really confused by this.
Let me try a shot at this.
Charlie, do you want to try? Okay.
Yeah, so Representative Dickinson, so the evidence-based approach does use a prototypical school size and format to come up with what you should be spending per student based on that prototypical size. And that's what the APA consulting firm had recommended, using that approach. And then when we worked with Doctors Colby and Baker to come up with a different cost function approach, that changed it to really look at what are we spending now and how are we going to achieve those outcomes, and give it some time to reflect what the new costs are operating with a new district in place and with some of the new policies that are put in place, minimum class sizes, that type of thing. So to get to a state in which we can better predict as to what those school sizes can be in the state and what your operating costs are, then you can move towards an evidence-based approach. Because right now we don't have any kind of prototypical school district size. There are maybe one or two that meet what Picus and Auden had suggested is 3,900 students in a school district. Very hard to find one of those districts in the existing state of Vermont that meets that criteria.
So you're hoping that at some point this new structure will create something that's similar to whatever the prototypical school size is, and what it costs, and what to expect if you follow that evidence-based
Yes,
analysis.
that is the theory, yes.
Okay.
But we won't move to that unless the theory proves out. So there'd have to be an analysis to determine, are we ready at this point to pull the trigger on changing the formula to fund those students in their school settings?
Okay, and so you won't know that until you're really like maybe 5 or 10 years into this.
I think this says for 5 years out. Is that what the timeline is? In a future state, yes.
In a future state. So we're going to go with what we got now. We're going to create this new structure. We're going to go with whatever this cost formula is that we have now, based on all these things that we're trying to do. And then 5 years into that, like in 2035, when none of us will be around, most likely, we will then go and sit down and say, okay, now is this going to be something that we can look at the Picus suggestions and the Colby suggestions and transfer this to an evidence-based amount that now follows other prototypical school situations around the country? Is that correct?
Yes, and on the very last page of the bill is when we have develop and review of an evidence-based formula by professional judgment panels. That's a third cost approach to it, but we won't get to that yet. But to make sure that at that point, when we're making that move, that 90% of the Vermont classes with class size minimum standards and the education quality standards are met. And also that 90% of Vermont school buildings with school size standards are also met. So there's a lot of work that has to go in before we get to that point.
Okay, thank you. I think I get it better.
Okay, and I think, John, you had a question also?
Yeah, it's kind of just related to what you just described here. You have to have enough years of information, data here. So I suspect every year, once this thing begins here for the 29-30 school year, which is what we're looking at here for the foundation formula in full, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Every year you have to kind of, take a look at that at year's end or 6 months in, just to kind of see where are we, how is this working here for us. Not to make a decision after year one, you would want to do that. It's kind of a silly thing for you to think about here, but to kind of see how things are progressing toward that date for the evidence-based formula, as it might have to be readjusted based on which year school and which not actually spending, or do they not have enough, one way or the other, or somewhere in between.
Right.
That's how I'm kind of thinking about this here.
Yeah, I think two pieces to note are what
And I don't remember all the language in there. I kind of skimmed through it.
so Rep. Kimball was mentioning here, the final section of the effective dates has those contingency guidelines for transitioning to an evidence-based funding formula. The other piece to keep in mind is that included in the bill is required every 5 years that AOE and JFO need to do what you're talking about, a recalibration of the base and weights based off of current data.
Otherwise, we could be way ahead in some circumstances, just falling behind.
Yeah, from the testimony we received, the worst thing to do is to set it and forget it. You have to always keep coming back to, is it the right number? Yeah.
Great, let's continue.
Okay, so now moving out of the world of foundation formulas, but staying in property tax and moving into section 61. This is the property classifications that we've already spoken about, those homestead and then the 3 non-homestead. With currently drafted, each classification factor having a factor of 1. Again, fiscal impact of this section is unclear. Department of Taxes is going to come back after they've had more time to think about potential cost of this work. Section 62 through 64 establish regional assessment districts, and this is moving to a statewide reappraisal system where these districts need to have a full reappraisal of their grand list every 6 years. And requires Department of Taxes to come back and submit a report about the implementation of the regional assessment districts next January.
So instead of appraisals or assessment by town, it would be by district? Is that the general idea?
Correct.
So it's
And this requires the PBR and tax to sort of do more of this interim work and come back and report to the General Assembly next January about this work.
So just the tax part of it, the evaluation, all that part of that, that could run separate from the rest of the education part, couldn't it?
The effective date could be, what's the effective date on that?
What I'm saying is, I mean, you're trying to get to a level playing field across the board. Getting towards that doesn't depend upon the education, the funding formula or anything like that, or even the district lines did, does it?
For the regional assessment districts? Yes, my understanding is that the regional assessment districts actually don't have the same, they have an effective date of a year later, or no, 6 months later, January 1, 2030. The committee was contemplating sort of having all of these significant changes in the property tax and education finance world all happening at the same time, that's a policy choice.
I mean, what I'm thinking is that, if one thing doesn't go ahead, there's no reason why the other couldn't go ahead.
I hear you. So do they have to necessarily line up? It would be nice if they did, but it doesn't really matter if all the properties are equally assessed across the state.
Right, so that's the horse in front of the cart. And if you get that horse in front of the cart, even if the cart couldn't quite be put down,
Yeah.
you get that done.
Right, and that's because we're trying to keep it stable. Horse and cart.
Oh,
What I did there?
I think there was a joke in there.
Thanks.
I got it.
Okay, let's continue.
There's just a few other pieces. The grand list assessment date is changed from April 1st to January 1st, sort of line up with all of these other changes that we're talking about. So we have the data all aligning at the same time. And then sections 92 through 94 are pieces that would normally be included in miscellaneous tax, but there's no miscellaneous tax bill, so those are included here.
I've never seen so many effective dates.
Yeah, I can't take credit. Emily Byrne did the first pass of putting this table together. But yeah, so this is the summary of the effective dates. We tried to put together the high level overview and then the relevant sections.
And the other thing that we printed was draft, it says draft, but is this other sort of transformation timeline.
And that is, yes, and that is, I cannot take any credit for that. That is the brainchild of John and Beth.
Oh, great.
Okay,
So
What can you take credit for?
What? What?
98%.
What, have I taken credit for?
You said your headache, you're suffering.
Yes. Even suffering.
So wouldn't you want to take credit?
So I wonder if, thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
This is a lot of work by a lot of people and appreciate your role in this. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
So we thank you for that. I would like to just sort of quickly review this transformation timeline. If John, you want to come up and talk to us about it. Charlie, you don't have to actually leave the room.
Just
Okay.
in front of us.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Will no longer shout from the sidelines. I will shout from the table. Timeline. I'm happy to pull this up on the screen. Let's see. Just a second. Gotta jump on the Zoom. And I know that's the window you want to see. Okay. Is that fairly visible?
There you go. Okay.
Okay. So this doesn't outline all of the effective dates that are in the bill, but it tries to hit some of the high level pieces and call out some seemingly smaller things, but reports along the way that speak to pieces that the bill just hasn't been able to address at a substantive level, other than outlining that there's a planning process for addressing these pieces, which are things that you guys have questioned throughout this process, right? Like what's happening on this piece? Well, in many cases, it's that a report is coming with the idea for updates in the future. So the first thing that happens upon passage is this school district boundaries subcommittee is created. And that's for setting up recommendations for 3 different sets of school district boundaries that would come back later this year. And there are a couple of immediate adult education funding changes that emerge from the House Commerce Committee. On July 1 of 2025, I think we've spoken about the school closure may require designation piece, but the School Construction Advisory Board is created. This is part of the school construction program, which does not come online until later, but to call out why this piece is created at an earlier date. There's a request for a report in December of this year on how to address the assumption of bonds at any point at which you transition to a new school district structure. So as you can imagine, there's debt out there at this point. What do we do at the point that you transition to a new set of school districts? So that school construction advisory board is created to address that topic. I can't speak to the education exclusive pieces, so I honestly don't know on the tuitioning piece here, but I know that you walked
About it. Yeah, so that's okay. That's just, yeah.
Yep. And maybe I can just go higher level then if a bunch of reports are due in December, transportation reimbursement, proposed school district boundaries, as we just discussed, a special ed strategic plan, which you'll recall included that appropriation, reports on adult education funding, inflationary measures and pre-K, and then updates to the homestead declaration for homestead exemption. For that proposal, you need to update that sample form for any informational needs of the new homestead exemption. In January 15th of 2026, report for the regional appraisals due from a working group among tax and stakeholders in July 1, 2026, so a year out from the summer. Class size minimums kick in, the school construction program comes online. As discussed before, we don't have a funding stream for that contemplated yet. And just to address some of the concerns that I think came up at that point, active steps have to be taken for an application to get through the process and be rewarded funding. So it's not something where there would accidentally be an obligation suddenly imposed upon the state. Okay, so more importantly, legislature, the intent expressed in section 1, which is the intent section of this bill, is that the legislature would enact new school district boundaries to be effective July 1, 2027, but that enactment would occur next summer. So the idea is that next session, you guys are tackling this subject, they'd be enacted and then to come effective July 1, 2027. So that's what you see in the next piece there, July 1, 2027, those new boundaries go into effect along with the voting awards. And then the statewide graduation requirements, which I think were spoken about earlier, would kick in for the class of 2031. In March 2028, the initial school board member special election would occur. The reason that this is, you're trying to get this election to occur soon enough to facilitate the future transition to a foundation formula. So if you maintained it on the traditional November cycle, you would be too late. So what's proposed is that there would be a special election to get those new school board members for the conceived larger school districts. And then those would be in place to start addressing the transition to the foundation formula. July 1, 28, statewide school calendar, and then updates to the December 1 letter. Julia talked about this. We have to kick in a couple of pieces of the foundation formula a little bit earlier, like some ancillary pieces, including the December 1 letter, so that you have data available at the point that you're starting to determine the budgeting and the like for the foundation formula. So you need the December 1 letter that emerges at the end of 2028 to contemplate the changes to the foundation formula. So that's why updates to the December 1 letter occur in July 1 of 2028. Does that make sense? I'm happy to
And
pause
so
it.
then the new December 1 letter comes out December 1 of 2028.
Exactly. And at that point, you would still be in the current funding system that we're in,
Right.
but it would be making recommendations for the following fiscal year when that foundation formula would have kicked in.
Jim.
I apologize if Julia mentioned this and I didn't register, but you've got the new school boundaries taking effect on July 2027. The financing.
Yes,
take effect till 2 years later.
exactly. So
How do you finance them in the meantime?
exactly. So what's actually happening at this point is there are two sets of districts available. There's one that's non-operational, that's just set up so that you're getting the structure in place. And that's the new school district boundaries. There's nothing happening within those districts. You're still in the current education system, but we need a transition period in which you've created the geographic areas, right? And then you're essentially doing a planning process to get up to speed on your budgeting and the like. But before the foundation formula kicks in, we're living in the current school district world. We just need to bring those online.
Towns, even though you'll ultimately be part of a different.
Exactly. At some point, the existing school districts would be extinguished
Yeah,
But until you move to the foundation formula, you cannot extinguish those existing school districts.
That just gives you a gate to draw lines around with.
Exactly, exactly. It allows you to start implementing the pieces that you need to have.
IT project, right? You can't drop the old system until the new one is.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Along with those, that transitionary phase, what you see for January 2029 is the addition of the new property classifications. And again, the reason these are added is not that they're intended to be used for taxation purposes. It's basically to allow data to be available so that when you set the rates, you would have the data that you need to do that. Is that just confirming with Kirby? Is that correct? Looks like I'm getting the yes.
Okay.
July 1, 2029, we got the switch to green. So that's meant to indicate something meaningful has happened. This is when everything occurs. So the new school district boundaries are now, the new school districts are now operational. So as we discussed, they would have been enacted and then the boundaries would have been set up prior to this date. But on 2029, they become operational, which means they're assuming responsibility for the education of all resident students. At that point, if you've met that contingency, on July 1, 2029, the new foundation formula kicks in. To support that, you have your new statewide education tax, which is across those 4 property classifications. You have the new supplemental district spending tax, which is your local spending for those school districts. You repeal the statewide property tax credit. You do hold on to the municipal property tax credit, just to make that clear, but you repeal the existing property tax credit and replace it with the homestead exemption. And at the same time, there is this tasking of the existing Ed Fund Advisory Committee to start evaluating the way that the formula works. This is a multi-year process, but we had talked before about that potential transition, and it is just potential from a cost factor to an evidence-based approach. So as soon as this comes online, there's a process in place to start evaluating whether or not that's a change that needs to happen in years to come. In January 1, 2030, that regional the reappraisals come online, and then in a future state, if contingencies are met, and I can walk them through here, you would transition to the evidence-based foundation formula if professional judgment panels have developed and reviewed an evidence-based foundation formula. So again, that would be new base and new weights. If 90% of classes meet education quality standards, class size standards, if 90% of schools meet education quality standards, school building parameters, and 100% implementation in all classes, in all schools of the multi-tiered systems of support.
What's that? That's a whole, yeah, never mind.
I'm glad
You go down that road. It's a way of supporting students and things based on.
Extra educationally, yeah.
Right.
Okay. Happy to answer questions about this, or if you have particular provisions of the bill you wanted to revisit. I did have a high-level overview, but you just got a high-level overview, so I want to duplicate that.
And we did go through it.
Yesterday.
Yes, and last week with Beth. So we've had a bunch of overviews, but sometimes it's good to, and I see that Lynn Dickinson has her hand raised. Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is helpful. This sort of reminds me on a much smaller scale, what we did when we transitioned BFA in St. Albans from a independent school to a union district high school. Overlapping school committees, overlapping governance, overlapping administrative. It is hard, and it is not something that is done lightly. And there's all kinds of conflicts that come from this. Who's in charge? Who gets to make the decisions? You've got here a very complicated process. To do it statewide is just overwhelming. You know, I don't know if it's easier to pull the Band-Aid off all at once sooner rather than later, but I mean, there's a lot of thought that's been put into this. But this is not an easy transition, and it might be just stretched out way too long. I mean, I understand planning makes the difference, and I know you need to plan, but we had a hard time in St. Albans doing this. It was highly political, and it was very difficult. And the community had voted 3-1 to do it. So, you know, I think I really appreciate seeing this timeline. It's really instructive, but it sort of brings me back. Has anybody thought of trying how this is going to actually, how you can avoid the pitfalls of this, or how you can go and prepare your communities for this? You know, trying to go from one board and one community to a larger board to, I mean, I know we need to do something, but I'm just sitting here looking at this and just sort of thinking, has anybody laid the groundwork for how this is going to work? Did anybody hear?
That's what it is. So that's why it takes a while, I think. Charlie, I don't know if you had these sort of conversations in your committee.
Don't go anywhere. We did. I know the education committee probably had more discussions than we did about this, but contained in the bill is that the Agency of Education would provide support to communities, and just some of the considerations that you're talking about, Representative Dickinson, to try to drive that conversation. So there's nothing specific in there because it's really not known exactly all the things that have to be done. So it is addressed in there, but only in a small way, I have to say.
Well, I think there's a lot of, I mean, I used to look at some of these things when you talk about planning and execution, and unfortunately, people tend to want to go to execution right away without doing all the planning. And planning needs to be like 75 or 80% of it. And then the execution part, when the final change happens, is usually a lot further down than people realize it needs to be. And often things fail because we skip from planning to execution much too quickly. So that's what I know in the work that I've done in previous lives. So it seems like we're trying to do a fair amount of planning before we suddenly just go.
And any one of these things on their own would be huge. Just governance, that'd be big. Delivery, huge. How we pay for it, enormous.
We can see the breadth and depth of what's gone into this, which is pretty astonishing across the body. And Tiff, you have a.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have been trying to take this in over the last week and really have a much clearer appreciation for how complicated this is, both on the policy side and on the financing side. And I think that you've built in certain checks or I mean, the reason that we're going to have some experience in time before we actually get to the evidence-based formula rate, right? And that makes a lot of sense to me because I mean, there's just so much that's going to be in flux, and it won't be until after the dust has settled that we have a sense of really what this will cost. So I appreciate, you know, the steps of the process. And I have a number of constituents who want to go faster, you know, and I am trying to explain why. You know, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But unless you dig in and really imagine all of the thinking that has to go into something like this, I don't think you appreciate. I mean, most of us can appreciate just how big this is.
Yeah, can I say one more thing?
Sure, go ahead.
I think Charlie coming from St. Albans can appreciate this. He hadn't been there in a long time, but what we did at BFA is we just changed the governance and the election of the school board. But all of the many years, the 30 years that it took to finally get to that end point, because it took 30 years and several tries along the way. Following Title 16, when we basically followed the statute that created the union high schools. And that is something that was done in a variety of communities here. It was a major change for Vermonters, forming union high schools, and it's been used several times since then. But they all went into effect immediately. There was no two boards, two groups, two administrations. It was once the bill passed, once the title statutes passed in a community and they created these union high schools, they went into effect immediately. And the old went away. The only reason BFA had to do what we did to have it stretch over 18 months is because we had to go to court to change a trust. And so we had the school board that was the trustees that were in place, and we had the elected school board members of what would be a new Union High School once that lawsuit was settled. And that was the place where we had the problems. I mean, we didn't have problems, but we had problems. We were sitting there jointly working on things together. There was a little bit of overlap, which you'll find is a lot of times there will be overlap between the former school board members and the new school board members, and they really will be doing two functions. That would be ideal, but it's still, it is very different from what we have in Title 16 now in looking at trying to consolidate schools and districts and even with 153, Act 153, when we did consolidations, and Act 46, I think they went into effect immediately. So my observation.
Yeah. And that was complicated, and it was just a very small piece of a project, not a statewide
Yes.
event.
Yes.
Don?
Just to add a little more to what was being suggested here about, how do we, inform our communities here, that needs to be a strategic piece as well. It needs to be stepwise. So we're not just saying, oh, it's going to be 2029, a couple of months, and we're ready to launch it off here. Just keeping, figuring out a best way to educate the communities here initially. Here's the plan. Here's the time frame here for it. Along the way, not just creating like a booklet that has all the parts and pieces of this. Now, some of this you're still working on and will be for the next, large time frame here. And so we've got to figure out the best way to educate our communities about that, which when I look back, a couple of years ago when we went through the apportionment here, it's your new district, people didn't know who they were voting for in many places because it just didn't roll out probably in the way it was intended here. We have to do a far better job of listening. It needs to be stepwise, and that's probably going to contribute to education here, but in coordination with the work that you're doing in your committee under Charlie and the work that's happening in both ed committees in the House and the Senate as well.
Yeah. Great.
Otherwise, this is going to be really confusing for a lot of folks.
Lots of communication.
Yeah.
Tom?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everybody who worked on this bill. You've been in your own bunkers, just like we've been down here. And, I moved to Vermont right before Act 60, so I didn't understand. Pre-Act 60, I didn't experience it. My kids weren't old enough to go in school yet. And so our whole life here in Vermont has been around Act 60 and sort of the sanctity of the constitutional needs to provide some access, financial or otherwise, for education. And it's been a really impressive tenet for us to hold. I know it catches a lot of grief because it's one of two that aren't based on foundation formulas, but I want to really, as complex as the formula has been over the years, it's actually quite elegant in many ways in achieving some of the issues that we've been dealing with. So I just, first of all, I want to thank the staff. I want to thank committees just for putting your head down and coming up with this proposal. With the understanding that if this passes through the House this week, it still has to go to the Senate and et cetera. I mean, this is what we end up voting on in the House is not the finished product, along with everything that has to be done that your committees have put forward as future issues to deal with. And again, the nuance that's in here, the work that's gone in here, is really quite thorough, and I just want to express my appreciation 100 times over. Madam Chair, what we're actually voting on is not all of this bill. It's a very infinitesimal chunk of the 157 pages
Yes,
bills. So I just want us to remember that as well, and then just,
right. On the floor, everybody will have an opportunity to vote on the entire bill. I mean, we vote on the bill, but we're voting in this case on the two appropriations, which is the 200,000 to the State Board of Education related to rulemaking, and the 150,000 for a position at the Agency of Education around special education, which is kind of a mess, and we would like to look at that because we're spending a lot of money and not really serving kids. I kind of got that right?
and so when we vote on this,
So that's how I will be thinking about it when I vote.
right, when we vote on this, I mean, we're still gonna be voting to,
We still have to vote on the bill.
with the support of the bill. We're not just taking out the 300.
No, we can't vote separately.
But again, specific to the appropriations committee, it's just that. That's the primary, again.
That's why it's in this committee.
Yes.
It's only because of those two things.
Yeah, and that's.
And then, so then there's still gonna be more time for all of you to look at. Charlie, you're having office hours tomorrow morning. Emily's got them this afternoon. So if people want to find out more about the bill for making their decisions for when it comes to the floor, then that's another conversation.
So we're not, I'm sorry, may I? So
Yes, please, Dave.
typically, on committee, you voted for the bill and the committee, you support the committee. But here I feel like I'm voting for this piece and I will make up my mind.
Yeah.
Later on, and that's okay.
Yes.
Want to make sure.
That's how I am viewing it. Not all bills really are like that necessarily, but
Right.
I kind of feel like this one is.
Two-part.
Yeah,
So I'm like,
Think
Yeah.
about this here, 2 weeks, and I think that's just a lot, it's outside of the money thing.
and so I can't tell you how you're going to think in your head when you vote, but that's
Yeah.
how. Jim, go ahead.
The money is certainly the reason why, as the chair said, why the bill is here. And that's what we have to pay attention to. However, when I look at this, when we vote on the bill, we're voting affirmatively or negatively to advance this bill out of our committee.
That's true too.
It's not an amendment we're voting on, that amendments and the bill itself might have different votes. We're voting to advance the bill as given to us to the floor.
That's correct.
But I'm just saying, I'm just one person, but that's how I look at
Can
it.
be true
And,
too.
and yes, I think there's a lot of ways to look at it.
There is.
And originally, I had at one iteration of the budget, FY 26 budget, money to go to the State Board of Education about rulemaking, which is really kind of separate from this bill about education transformation. So that was the only reason this was coming at the time, I thought, and then I didn't know about the 150. And one could argue that even if the rest of the bill doesn't pass, there could be a separate bill for the 150,000 around special ed, because that's really separate from education transformation. So there's lots of different ways to think about this. And so my question to the committee is right now, we have Emily coming in shortly and then Adam and Sarah. Do you want to vote right now, or do you want to take a quick 5-minute break and then come back and
I'd
vote?
like to take more than a 5-minute break.
We don't have lots of time.
Well, it's 3:00.
Okay, we can do 10 minutes. Emily was going to come at 3. She can come at 3:15. So let's take 10 minutes. We'll be back here and vote at 3:10. Okay?
Madam Chair, just
Yes.
before you go, you rightly called out the staff did an incredible amount of work. I mean, this
Yes.
is, this fiscal note by itself is, to me, a work of art.
Yes.
But the staff really did go way beyond what we ordinarily ask them, so we owe a lot to
We
them.
really want to thank all of you. It's just, this has been about one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my time here. So we really do appreciate all of your work.
So, can I-
Oh, separate cabaret. Okay.